HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Trouble in the Brasses by Charlotte Macleod, read by William Dufris.
For Paula and Jim Francis, without whose help this would never have happened. Chapter 1.
"Mother, what am I doing here?"
whispered Detective Inspector Madoc Rhys.
"Shh!"
Madoc was not a whit surprised at Lady Rhys's reaction. He had been asking her the same sort of question and getting the same sort of answer ever since she'd deemed him old enough to come with her and watch his father at work. It had taken him quite a while as a child to figure out precisely what Sir Emlyn was accomplishing by standing up on a little box in front of a lot of people dressed up as penguins, turning his back to the audience and waving his arms around. It had taken his parents still longer to accept the realization that he, the second of their 3 children, was hopelessly, incontrovertibly, and quite shamelessly tone-deaf. While his elder brother, Dufris, warbled and preened his way toward operatic fame and even got to sing lead tenor in oratorio and cantata under his father's direction, Madoc had played cops and robbers with the kids in the neighborhood. In contrast to his younger sister, Gwendolen, who'd cut her 6-year molars on a clarinet reed and taken her place in some well-known chamber music ensembles before she'd felt the first swelling of a wisdom tooth, Madoc had devoted himself to reading Renfrew of the Royal Mounted and collecting his classmates' fingerprints. When he'd gone all through school without learning to tell a B natural from a C sharp, his parents had finally announced they were washing their hands of him. He'd thanked them politely and applied as a recruit to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Diplomatic relations were a good deal less strained now that Madoc had got married and set up housekeeping. However, Lady Rhys still hadn't got over her habit of murmuring vaguely on the rare occasions when her younger son's name came up that Madoc had a position with the Canadian government in research. Now, out of the blue, he'd received an urgent request to join his parents on tour and not to bring Janet, and he still hadn't the remotest idea why. It was Janet herself who had passed on the message. She'd called him at work, as puzzled as he, to say that Sir Emlyn himself had phoned right after Madoc had left the house. That was almost unheard of to begin with. Except on the podium, that gentle little man was usually content to let his wife handle the amenities, not to mention everything else that had to be coped with. Used to unquestioning obedience from his singers and musicians, Sir Emlyn had merely stated in the kindest and sweetest way where he could be found, at which times of the day, and that he hoped Madoc would lose no time in joining him and Silly, this being his pet and wholly non-disrespectful name for Lady Rhys. He had added his regrets that it would not be convenient for Janet to come this time, bade her a fond goodbye, and hung up.
"But that's crazy," Madoc had replied. "Tad likes you far better than he does me."
Tad wasn't a nickname, merely the Welsh word for father. Janet had replied that he shouldn't talk foolishness, that she'd worked out plane reservations which would get him to Wagstaffe at 20 to 8, and should she confirm them, she'd have his bag packed in half an hour, and what time did he want her to drive him to the airport? So, that was that. He'd explained the situation to his superior and spent the day clearing his desk. There wouldn't be any organizational problem. He'd planned to take a couple of days off anyway because Janet's sister-in-law was already booked for a visit. He'd be sorry to miss Annabelle, but she'd be company for Janet. No doubt the 2 women would have a lot more fun than he would. The plane had been a few minutes late, as planes so often were. He'd got to the hall by the skin of his teeth. A tight-lipped Lady Rhys had met him at the box office and hustled him up to her private box with no more than a,
"Hurry, the doors are closing."
Sir Emlyn was a stickler for starting on the dot and for allowing nobody to enter the concert hall while the musicians were performing. Back in England, he'd been known to keep certain members of the royal family standing outside until after the first number, though, of course, never the Queen Mum, of whom both he and Lady Rhys were particularly fond. Early training had taught Madoc to endure with fortitude what his tin ear prevented him from enjoying. Police training and natural propensity were keeping him on the alert now. His mother had handed him a program, but he hadn't bothered to find out what was being played. The pieces all sounded pretty much alike to him. The words, for there was always singing when Sir Emlyn conducted, wouldn't make any great sense. They never did. Since he was too prominently displayed to amuse himself spotting present or potential criminals in the audience, Madoc concentrated on the performers. At least one got a bird's-eye view of the stage from here. He'd known the names of the various instruments from early boyhood, of course. Even though he couldn't tell them apart by their sounds, he'd never have passed up the chance to assimilate odd bits of information that might come in handy someday to the police detective he was going to be. Originally, Madoc had been most interested in the oboes and bassoons, but only because he had thought their skinny mouthpieces were drinking straws, and those long tubes they were stuck into must be full of some delicious liquid that he wasn't getting a taste of, and it wasn't fair. The brasses had disgusted him, because the musicians were, he thought, always shaking spit out of them. Somewhere along the line he'd learned that it wasn't spit, merely condensation formed by the player's hot breath against the cooler metal that had to be got rid of, so that the sound wouldn't come out as a gurgle instead of a moo. He'd asked his father once why a moo was any better than a gurgle, but had got only a sigh and a mournful glance in reply. All things considered, Madoc and his father had always gone on well enough. Sir Emlyn had made it plain that he felt his younger son was more to be pitied than censured, and had been nice to him in small ways. He had taken Madoc for little walks to visit the sheep and the hens while they were staying with old Sir Caradoc on the family farm back in Wales, as they often did. He had listened to Madoc's reports of boyish exploits and tried to nod in the right places. He had brought back presents from tours, usually the wrong sort of equipment, for sports Madoc wasn't much interested in playing anyway. They had done their real communicating with shy smiles, hand clasps, and the occasional embarrassed hug. Madoc was astonished to realize how much he loved the diffident little chap who could cause all that noise to be made up there. He was immensely relieved when the racket ceased in a tumult of clangs, bleats, and squawks, and he could tackle his mother again.
"Mum, for God's sake tell me, what's this all about?"
Conscious of eyes upon her, Lady Rhys favored her son with a fond parental smile and leaned toward him with a playful manner, as playful as Lady Rhys ever got anyway, for she was always conscious of what she owed her husband's position. She was a handsome woman still. All the Rhysses were good-looking, even Madoc. Her hair was neither black like his, nor silver like her husband's, but chestnut brown, without the aid of artifice, and worn sleeked back into a chignon. As usual, she was wearing her diamonds and a floor-length black gown with elegantly flowing sleeves. Black satin for fall, Madoc noted. She wouldn't go into black velvet until around the 1st of December. In spring, the gown would be black crepe or lace, and in summer, black chiffon. She bought replacements every 5 years or so and saved the old ones to take along for emergencies. Her system saved a lot of fuss and bother on the road. There was always enough of that without adding a lavish wardrobe for the conductor's wife. When she deemed the moment right, Lady Rhys raised her program so that it hid her mouth and murmured under its cover,
"Your father's having trouble with the brasses. Keep your eye on the first trombone."
She then sat back and waited for the applause to die down and her husband to start waving his arms again. Madoc borrowed his mother's opera glasses, wondering what sort of trouble the brasses were giving and which was the first trombone. He assumed his mother meant, in fact, not the trombone, but the trombonist. There were 3 of them on stage at the moment. One, a large, heavy-set man of 45 or so, with a bright red face. One, a smallish young fellow with a great deal of curly blonde hair. And one who was medium-sized, neither young nor old, and had no particularly distinguishing feature about him. Professional instinct told him this was the man to watch. But it was the big chap who was giving the trouble. Trouble there was, even though it might not be discernible to the eyes of untrained observers. The trombonist had something that looked like a long whisker hanging from the tip of his slide. A piece of fish line, perhaps, or gut from a snell. With this, the man was contriving, whenever he stretched out his instrument to its full length, to tickle the neck of the flautist who sat in front of him. The flautist was a reasonably attractive, not young woman. Like the other female musicians, she wore a long black dress. Hers happened to have a neckline that was scooped out a bit across the shoulders. Having that whiskerish thing dragged across her bare skin while she was trying to keep her place and hit the right notes must be maddening. And that wasn't the worst. Every so often, during a pause, the trombonist would shake the moisture out of his instrument. Whenever he shook, Madoc could see the woman wince. Trumpeters and violinists were feisty by nature. One of these might have turned around and slugged him if he tried such a trick on them. Flautists were competitive, but not likely to be combative. Madoc wondered for a moment whether his father had arranged this somewhat unusual seating in order to avoid any contretemps. But he couldn't see the ever-courteous Sir Emlyn Rhys penalizing a musician for being dependably well-behaved. Was it possible his father simply didn't know what was going on? Yes, Madoc decided. It was more than possible. To begin with, Sir Emlyn didn't look at any orchestra, even the prestigious Wagstaffe Symphony, a great deal. He was primarily a choral director, and his first attention was always on his singers. He'd come to regard instrumentalists more or less as nice, steady workhorses who could be counted on not to throw temperaments, catch colds, or have babies at awkward times. All evidence to the contrary notwithstanding. Madoc had noticed years ago, when he'd been allowed to watch his father from the wings, that when there was no chorus to worry about, Sir Emlyn often led the orchestra with his eyes shut. When Madoc asked him why, he'd replied, "I can see better with my ears." That was another one which had taken the boy a while to figure out. In any event, Sir Emlyn would hardly have sent out an SOS over a childish trick like this. What was going on here? Madoc checked out the trumpets. Trumpeters were not the most sedate among the musicians as a rule, or so he had been told, but this lot appeared to be behaving themselves well enough at the moment. The French horns were another matter. Nobody was doing anything wrong, but something definitely wasn't right. Two of the horn players were casting uneasy looks at the man between them, even while they ought to have been keeping their full attention on the score. The one in the middle was puffing away, as he presumably ought to have been, since Sir Emlyn had just pointed the baton in his direction. However, Madoc could see he was making awfully heavy work of it. Sweat was standing out on his forehead. His face was turning gradually from pink to yellow to stark white to a strange pea-green. Madoc nudged his mother and handed her back the opera glasses. She gave him another of her tight-lipped glances. Then she looked where he was looking, and her lips pressed even tighter. Madoc thought he knew what was happening. Musicians, as he'd heard often enough, tended to have martyr complexes. Rather than miss a performance and thus concede that the show could go on without them, they'd drag themselves to work with broken legs and raging fevers. This chap must have been hit by a bug of some kind and had risked infecting the entire orchestra rather than desert his chair. Was he going to be sick on stage? No, thank God he wasn't. The intermission had arrived. Sir Emlyn was taking his bows, asking the orchestra to rise. The whole group must by now be aware of their colleague's plight. They let the horns go off first, the two who had been sitting beside the sick man, helping him off before any of the others. The maneuver was slickly accomplished. Probably few in the audience noticed anything amiss. Lady Rhys waited until her husband made his final appearance and dismissed the orchestra. Then she stood up and collected her furs. "Let's pop backstage for a jiffy and let your father know you've arrived," she said, just loud enough for those in the next box to overhear and understand that her going didn't mean they could too. Madoc hoped, for his mother's sake, that they wouldn't come upon the ailing horn player making a ghastly mess backstage, but he hoped in vain. The mess was already made. The musician lay face down in the midst of it. Some of his comrades huddled around, all of them looking pretty green, too. And these, judging from certain background noises, were the strong-stomached ones. Lady Rhys took command. "Well, don't everyone just stand there. Frida, go find Lucy Shadd and tell her to call an ambulance immediately. Joseph, fetch the stretcher from the first aid rack down the hall. We'll take him to the musician's room until the doctor comes. Jason, find one of the stage crew. Tell him to bring some sawdust and a scrubbing pail. The rest of you clear out of here. Not you, Cedric. I want you to help carry the stretcher."
"Lady Rhys, can't you get the technicians to do it?"
"My heart fiddlesticks! The technicians are busy on stage, and you're fit as a flea. Don't think I didn't notice you lugging that silly little blonde all around the swimming pool back in Atlanta."
"Wilhelm weighs a hell of a lot more than she did,"
grumbled the beefy man, Madoc recognized as the jester of the trombone section. "But you'll only be carrying half of him," Lady Rhys pointed out reasonably. "What's the matter with you, Wilhelm? Surely you haven't been silly enough to eat fried oysters again?" Wilhelm didn't answer or give any sign that he had heard. Lifting her satin skirt and being extremely careful where she placed her satin slippers, Lady Rhys bent over him. "Wilhelm, speak to me. Where does it hurt?" "You'd better step back, Mother," said Madoc quietly. "The stretcher's here. Lay it down by his feet, sir, would you?" He was fairly sure what ailed the French horn player. Wilhelm's feet offered no resistance when Madoc grabbed hold of the ankles and skidded him clear of the mess he had made. Once the flaccid body had been rolled over onto the stretcher, everybody would know. Cedric, the trombonist, was first to realize what had happened.
"My God!"
he exclaimed in what could only be described as a screaming whisper.
"He's dead!"
"Cedric, this is no time for hysterics," snapped Lady Rhys. "Wilhelm's dehydrated himself and gone into shock, that's all. And bad enough, the silly man. He'll have to miss the plane, and Lucy will be hopping. Take his foot end. Jason, take his head. Follow me." Jason was one of the trumpeters who had helped Wilhelm off stage. Madoc wondered momentarily whether his mother had forgotten she had a son available, or if she'd deliberately not asked him to help with the stretcher, because it might impair his father's image to have a son doing manual labor in front of the musicians. No, Lady Rhys was not a foolish woman. She was used to bossing musicians around, that was all, and she had done what came naturally. A stagehand was hurrying along the corridor with a mop and bucket. He mustn't be stopped from doing what naturally had to be done. Madoc did what came naturally, too. There was a water cooler standing near the stage entrance, with a holder full of midget paper cups attached to it. As much by instinct as by intention, he used a couple of the cups to scoop up samples of the revolting mess on the floor and sealed them inside one of the small plastic bags that were as much a part of his daily garb as his shoes and socks. Whatever had killed the horn player had started to do its job at least half an hour ago, maybe a good deal longer. Madoc put the little bag in his pocket and went to find his parents. Chapter 2. "Why the police, Lucy?" Lady Rhys's sharp question didn't cause the trim elderly woman in the smart gray flannel suit to turn a hair. "Because that was the fastest way to get ambulance service, Lady Rhys. Besides, if it turns out there's something really wrong with Wilhelm, we'd have to call them anyway." Really wrong was carrying euphemism to its outermost limit, Madoc thought. The poor chap was dead as last week's news. It needn't have taken the uniformed officer or the white-coated intern with the stethoscope to determine that. The young intern was straightening up now, turning to Lady Rhys as the obvious person in charge, even though Sir Emlyn was now standing with his usual appearance of gentle melancholy a step or two behind her. "He's gone, I'm afraid. Would you happen to know whether he had any history of chronic illness?" "Oh, yes," her ladyship replied. "Wilhelm had a terrible stomach, and he wouldn't stop eating things he wasn't supposed to have. Fried fish, you know, and heavy pastries, and far too much coffee, and—" Lady Rhys whipped a lace-trimmed handkerchief out of her sleeve and pressed it to her mouth. Lucy took over. "Lady Rhys is quite right. It was chronic bleeding ulcers, I believe. Poor Wilhelm was always a terrible glutton."
"You knew him pretty well, then?" the policeman asked her.
"I'd known him most of my life, off and on. We played together in the Champlain Symphony when we were both starting out, and later in the Sackbut Sextet. After I joined the Wagstaffe Symphony as a horn player quite some years ago, I played in the same section with him. I don't know whether you realize it, officer, but an orchestra exists in a little world of its own, especially when it's on tour, as we are now. We get very close to each other. As director of operations, I'm the one who's supposed to keep our little world spinning, so I have to be aware of things like the special diet problems of certain orchestra members. I tried to keep Wilhelm off the fried clams and fried chicken and fried this and fried that, but he had a positive passion for grease. Lately he had been stuffing worse than ever, it seemed."
"Did he show any other suicidal impulses?" the intern asked.
Lucy Shadd stared at him. "I'm not sure what you mean, Doctor."
"Well, a person who has a known disability and persists in doing things that make it worse is playing Russian roulette with his life," the young man answered pedantically. "Usually it's because the person is depressed and has a subconscious or maybe even conscious urge to get his misery over with. Would you say your friend here was more down in the mouth than usual?"
Lucy looked at Lady Rhys, who shook her head. "If he was, I certainly didn't notice. It seems to me he went right on telling his dirty stories and playing his decidedly unfunny practical jokes much as usual."
"He put a lump of plastic dog do in my instrument case only yesterday," a nearby violist volunteered. "I'd say he was still full of the old pep and vinegar."
Lucy scowled. "Oh, you wouldn't see anything wrong with anybody if he dropped dead at your—" She choked a bit. "Actually, Doctor, I have to say Wilhelm had good reason to be depressed, even aside from his stomach. He was losing his embouchure." "His what?" "It's something that happens to wind players, particularly the brasses. One's lip muscles become so painful from the constant strain that one simply can't endure to play any longer. That's why I myself work backstage nowadays instead of out front. At least I was able to adapt when it happened to me, but Wilhelm was such a dunderhead. Except about the horn. He was a superb French horn player. Nobody can take that away from him."
Lucy Shadd sounded rather fierce, and as if she had just about run out of composure. Lady Rhys laid a diamond-laden hand on her shoulder.
"Let's see if we can find ourselves a cup of tea, shall we? What happens next, Doctor? Do we call an undertaker? Not to sound callous, but we have to push on to Vancouver right after the performance."
"Well, there'll have to be an autopsy, I'm afraid," the intern apologized. "It's a matter of routine in a sudden death like this. Isn't that right, officer?"
The policeman nodded.
"That's right, ma'am. Could you give me the deceased's full name and address? Did he have a family?"
Lucy had got hold of herself. "His full name was Wilhelm Jan Ox. I believe his only close relative is a brother in Manitoba. I have his and the brother's address in my files, but they're packed with the luggage. I can dig them out and call the police station with the information as soon as I find them, if that's acceptable."
The policeman said that would be fine. The intern, the policeman, and the ambulance driver, who hadn't said a word the whole time, wrapped the body in green plastic and transferred it to the stretcher they'd brought with them. By now, intermission was almost over, and the musicians had to hurry on stage. Nobody took any notice when Madoc followed the policeman out to the vestibule and handed him the little plastic bag of vomit.
"How did you happen to think of doing this, Mr. Rhys?" the man asked him, somewhat suspiciously.
"I'd been reading a detective story on the plane."
That was no lie. Madoc had picked one up in the terminal to while away the flight. He'd found it hilarious.
"The mess could hardly be left there, you know, with half the concert still to play, but I thought somebody ought to do something."
"How come you didn't put up a howl when they wanted to move the body?"
The cop was finding him mildly amusing, too. Madoc decided to take the question seriously. "Because I knew it didn't matter. You see, Ox didn't just drop down dead all of a sudden. He'd been sick for quite some time. My mother and I were sitting in the front row, and we could see him getting greener and greener. I didn't think he was going to hold out till intermission. The chaps around him were worried too, I could tell. They took him between them and got him off as soon as they possibly could. I doubt whether Ox would have made it on his own."
"Yes, I know. I have their testimony. Well, thanks for the doggy bag, Mr. Rhys. What do you do in the orchestra?"
"Nothing at all. I hadn't even met any of them till just now. I popped up this evening from Fredericton for a little visit with my parents, whom I hadn't seen for a while. I have to catch them as I can. They're on tour so much of the time."
"I can imagine. Must be hard on your mother."
"Oh, no, she loves throwing her weight about. The conductor's wife is always the power behind the podium."
"Well, that figures. Are you a musician yourself, Mr. Rhys?"
"Not me. I have a rather tedious job with the Canadian government," Madoc replied disingenuously. He was on ticklish ground, all too aware of what his standing in the family would be if he let drop so much as the mere breath of an inkling that he might possibly be here on police business himself. Wilhelm Ox's death by gluttony was something this nice fellow would easily accept. Wilhelm Ox's sudden demise, coupled with whatever it was that had driven Sir Emlyn Rhys to send for his son the Mountie, might be enough to bring the tour to a screeching halt right here and now. Just finding out who he was might get the local authorities wondering. If they decided to hold the orchestra members here, bang would go Madoc's newfound popularity in the family circle. That consideration alone would not, of course, have had any weight in striking a balance between his professional and his filial obligations. However, Madoc honestly didn't see why he should break his father's heart on the off chance that Wilhelm Ox might have succumbed to something other than his own greed. Sir Emlyn was the humblest of men, but he did have one boast. In all his years of conducting, he had never once failed to show up on time for a scheduled performance. Why should this be an exception? The autopsy and his little paper cup, if the police bothered to have it analyzed, should settle the matter. If there had to be any further investigation, it would be undertaken by the right people, namely people other than Madoc Rhys. If any of the orchestra members were needed, they'd be available. Nobody in this crowd was going anywhere except to the Fraser River Music Festival, where they'd been booked for over a year in advance. If it was somebody from outside who'd put an end to Wilhelm's career before his lip muscles gave out, then it wouldn't matter where the musicians were anyway. All very rational. But Madoc still felt guilty. Blast it! Why couldn't his father have come straight out and said what the trouble was? There'd have been no chance to talk to him about it backstage, even if the cop hadn't been present. Sir Emlyn was short a French horn. That would be tragedy enough for the moment. Madoc could hear the tentative squeaks and blats, which meant the orchestra was tuning up. He headed back to his seat, got an icy glance from his mother, and spent the latter half of the concert wondering how he might decently and reasonably get hold of that autopsy report on Wilhelm Jan Ox. Most likely nobody would be doing anything about it tonight anyway. Depending on how many cadavers the pathologist had lined up ahead of Ox, results might not be available tomorrow either. If nothing came through by tomorrow night, he'd get the efficient Lucy Shadd to give the coroner's office a buzz. From Vancouver, that would be. Madoc hadn't expected to be traveling with the orchestra. What he'd envisioned was a reasonably amicable meal with his parents in a comfortable restaurant before the performance, a fast but thorough briefing on the trouble with the brasses, if in fact that was what Sir Emlyn had called him about, and maybe a day or so spent sniffing around asking guilefully stupid questions. By that time, he'd assumed all would be clear. The miscreant or miscreants would have been turned over to Lady Rhys for excoriation, and if their offenses were heinous enough, excommunication, and he'd be on his way home to Janet. He hadn't even got any dinner, only a little box of semi-edibles, described as a snack, and a cup of lukewarm coffee on the plane, Lunch had been another sandwich eaten at his desk and a mug of stewed tea. Damn it, he was hungry. Madoc had never been much.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?